Sophie, till late in the third quarter, you guys were struggling offensively in that frame. Second half in general didn't feel the same as the first half on that end. Did something change for you guys? What did you see as kind of leading to stalling on that end?
Yeah, I think we were just kind of slow. And every time that we're slow, especially defensively.
Sophie Cunningham didn't mince her words after this one, and she had every reason not to. The Indiana Fever just blew a winnable game, falling 88-84 to a Washington Mystics team sitting at the bottom of the standings. And when the cameras rolled for the post-game interviews, Cunningham delivered a brutally honest reality check that cut through every excuse and highlighted exactly what's wrong with this Fever squad right now. Her words hit different because they came from someone who watched a double-digit lead evaporate in real time, someone who saw playoff hopes slipping away against a team they absolutely should have beaten. What Cunningham said in that locker room afterwards will make you understand why fans are calling for heads to roll, why the coaching staff is under fire.
Sims, who goes coast to coast and lays it in.
So they had to make sure they had the right shot clock time as well while they were reviewing that.
So Indiana with a 10-point lead here, 6 minutes until halftime as Boston finds some space and knocks it down. Now Sims launches ahead for Mitchell. What a pass by Odyssey Sims.
And why this loss might be the breaking point for a franchise that's been searching for answers all season long. Because while Cunningham was taking accountability and demanding her team get back to being dogs, her coach was making excuses that left everyone scratching their heads. This wasn't just another regular season stumble. This was a statement game gone wrong, a playoff positioning nightmare, and a perfect storm of questionable coaching decisions that had Indiana fans ready to riot. The Fever entered this match.
Time for the Buckeyes.
Here is the Buckeye product on a backdoor pass, but Mitchell lost the handle. Sutton thought about the three, steps in, Hull got a piece. Dolson has been wide open all possession, splashes home a three, and we are level at 40.
Knowing exactly what was at stake, sitting in playoff contention, but far from secure, every game matters when you're trying to prove you belong in the postseason conversation. Washington, meanwhile, was playing spoiler with nothing to lose and everything to gain by knocking off a team desperately trying to climb the standings. Indiana came out looking exactly like the team everyone expected them to be. They were aggressive, they were focused, and they were dominating. By the second quarter,
Sims with 5 off the bench. Indiana has 8 first-quarter bench points. That's typically been a strength when they're playing well, as Iriafin just bullies her way inside. Now Citron being guarded by Lexi Hull. Hull goes over the screen, defends her really well. Citron just has to fire it up, and a circus shot for Citron.
the Fever had built what looked like a comfortable 13-point cushion, leading 40-27, and the home crowd was feeling good about their chances. Everything was clicking. The ball was moving, shots were falling, and it genuinely felt like Indiana was about to cruise to a much-needed victory against an inferior opponent. But then something shifted, and it happened so fast it left everyone in the building stunned. Washington unleashed a 22-7 run that didn't just cut into the lead, it completely flipped the script. The Mystics started executing with a confidence nobody saw.
Yeah, it's up to the chat. Get excited! Why at the same time? Because I'm you and you're me. We switch bodies.
Coming, shooting an incredible 52% from the field while knocking down big three-pointers that silenced the crowd. Meanwhile, Indiana's offense went from smooth to stagnant in what felt like minutes. What should have been a decisive win turned into a nail-biting, one-possession nightmare that had Fever fans holding their breath. Here's what made this collapse so painful to watch. This wasn't Washington pulling off some miraculous comeback fueled by superstar performances. This wasn't the Mystics catching fire and playing out of their minds. This was Indiana losing their grip on a game.
Hand off Mitchell. Indiana has to hurry. Lob back for Boston. Boston finishes. It's a 2-point game, 5.9 seconds remaining.
They completely controlled. The turnovers started piling up. The defensive breakdowns became constant. And suddenly every possession felt like a struggle. Indiana committed 21 fouls that sent Washington to the free throw line 26 times, basically handing the Mystics easy points whenever they needed them. Every careless turnover, every late rotation, every unnecessary foul was another nail in the coffin. And the most frustrating part? These were mistakes Indiana had complete control over. This wasn't about bad calls from the referees.
Finds Mitchell, launches a corner three. It won't go. Rebound Ainxler. And this young Washington Mystics group who continues to impress throughout this season. And Sidney Johnson in his first year comes up with a big win on the...
Or unlucky bounces. This was about a team that forgot how to execute when it mattered most. A team that let a winnable game slip through their fingers because they couldn't maintain their composure. Adding salt to the wound were the players who made Indiana pay for their mistakes. Washington's rookie duo stepped up in ways that had to sting for every Fever fan watching. Sonia...
We over-dribbled at times. Our off-ball movement wasn't there. We did a lot of standing. It's almost like we gave the ball to Kelsey and just tried to watch her work. And that's not when we're at our best. I mean, yes, certainly we want to have the ball in our hands, but we've got to continue to get movement with and without the basketball. It was getting stuck. I mean, we want to play 0.5 to 1 second basketball, and we weren't. It's
Citroen looked completely unshaken by the moment, pouring in 21 points and making clutch shots when the Mystics needed them most. Meanwhile, Kikian dominated the paint with 18 points and 12 rebounds, including several second-chance opportunities that completely swung momentum. These weren't established stars having career nights. These were young players who saw an opportunity and seized it while Indiana's veterans struggled to maintain control. The fact that two rookies could come into Indianapolis and dismantle a playoff hopeful team's lead should have been a wake-up call. Instead, it became a perfect example of what happens when you stop dictating the tempo and let an opponent gain confidence. Washington came in with nothing to lose and everything to prove, while Indiana played like a team that expected things to just work out because they were supposed to be better. But here's where the story gets really...
Tonight, were there thoughts of maybe plugging her in to try and spark the offense a little bit, or what was the decision behind not playing her tonight?
Yeah, there were some thoughts. I think that it matched up defensively more than anything with the way that we were going to try to play them, or in some of our switches and things like that. So that was mostly the reason.
And then just with the rotation, was it just those eight or seven that you ran with? Was it just they were flowing well and you wanted to just leave that going, or what was the thought there?
Yeah, I think some of it was defense. Being able to execute the type.
Interesting, because Indiana's individual players actually showed up. Aaliyah Boston was excellent inside, dropping 20 points and grabbing 9 rebounds with the kind of steady production that typically anchors victories. Kelsey Mitchell did everything she could, facilitating well early and finishing with 14 points and 9 assists despite being asked to carry way too much of the offensive load. Sophie Cunningham brought her usual energy and defensive intensity, while Lexi Hull contributed solid defensive effort throughout. Even Odyssey Sims, barely 2 games into her hardship contract, chipped in 11 points and provided the closest thing to true point guard play this roster has right now. The players worked their tails off and refused to quit, which makes what happened next even harder to swallow. This wasn't a collapse driven by lack of effort or individual failures. This was a team that had enough talent on the floor to win, enough fight to keep competing, and enough individual production to get the job done. The problem was everything else. The rotations, the adjustments, the in-game management that should have protected that lead and closed out a struggling opponent. Which brings us to the elephant in the room that had fans absolutely furious. Chloe Bibby, who's shooting 42% from three-point range this season, logged exactly 0 minutes in a game where spacing and perimeter shooting completely dried up. When the offense started getting stuck and Washington began loading the paint against Indiana's predictable isolation plays, the most obvious solution was sitting on the bench in street clothes. When asked about it afterwards, Coach Stephanie White explained she was worried about defensive matchup concerns and rebounding responsibilities, but that reasoning fell flat when you watched how the game actually played out. Indiana gave up those 26 free throws anyway. They surrendered wide open threes anyway. They watched Washington dominate the paint anyway. All those defensive issues White was trying to avoid happened regardless, except now they happened without having a proven floor spacer available to counter with. Fans watched Kelsey Mitchell drive into double and triple teams while shooters like Bibby sat and used, and they had every right to be frustrated with that logic. The offense becoming predictable wasn't some mysterious development. White herself admitted afterwards that possessions were getting stuck, that too often the game plan devolved into giving Mitchell the ball and hoping she could create something against multiple defenders. That's not a knock on Mitchell, who performed admirably under impossible circumstances, but it's exactly the kind of situation where having additional shooters on the floor becomes crucial. When your system breaks down into isolation basketball, you need spacing to give your star players room to operate. Instead, Indiana kept running the same sets that Washington had already figured out how to stop. Mitchell would drive into congested lanes, take contested shots while shooters stood untouched on the perimeter, and the result was exactly what you'd expect. The Mystics loaded up the paint, made everything difficult, and forced Indiana into the kind of grinding, half-court game that favored the team with nothing to lose. Meanwhile, the context surrounding this roster makes the loss even more painful. This team is playing without their foundation. Caitlin Clark is still sidelined with no clear timetable for return. Both Sydney Colson and Lexi McDonald went down with season-ending injuries in the same week, leaving Indiana scrambling to find reliable ball handlers just to field a competitive lineup. The front office had to sign players like Sims and Lambert just to have enough bodies to run practices. For a team suddenly stripped of its primary initiators and facing this level of adversity, the fact that they stayed in control as long as they did actually says something positive about their character. Boston had to carry even more responsibility inside. Mitchell's workload basically doubled overnight. Cunningham shifted into a larger facilitator role while still handling all her defensive assignments. These players were asked to do more than their normal jobs, and they responded with the kind of effort that usually gets rewarded with victories. There were clear moments when that collective grind almost pulled them through. Boston's inside presence kept drawing defenders and creating opportunities for teammates. Mitchell's driving ability forced Washington to collapse, opening up space even when her own shots didn't fall. Cunningham had that emotional highlight steal and three-pointer that jolted energy back into the building just when things looked shaky. Sims proved exactly why she was signed, using her ball handling skills to keep possessions alive and prevent Indiana from unraveling sooner. These were the kinds of plays that separate teams that roll over from teams that keep fighting deep into the fourth quarter. The effort was there, the individual production was there, and the fight was definitely there. What wasn't there were the strategic adjustments to channel all that effort into a closing plan that could finish off a struggling opponent. Which brings us to the post-game interviews that really tell this story. Sophie Cunningham walked into that media session and didn't dance around anything. She acknowledged the injuries, she recognized the adversity, but she also delivered a message that cut straight to the heart of the problem. The Fever, in her words, needed to get back to being dogs. Not next week, not when everyone gets healthy, but right now with the roster they have. Cunningham wasn't making excuses about missing players or tough matchups. She was calling out a mentality issue, recognizing that opponents no longer fear this Indiana team and are treating the Fever like a squad to exploit rather than respect. Her demand was clear and urgent. Find that edge again. Reclaim the toughness that made this team dangerous, and stop allowing the same preventable mistakes to pile up game after game. That message hit different because it came from someone who had just watched a winnable game slip away in real time. Cunningham saw the 13-point lead evaporate, she felt the momentum shift, and she recognized that this loss was about more than just one bad night. This was about a pattern of strong stretches followed by preventable collapses, a pattern that's been haunting the Fever all season long. Now compare that accountability to what came from the coaching staff. Stephanie White accurately identified the problems, acknowledging that the offense was getting stuck and that fouling had become a major issue. She wasn't wrong to highlight those concerns, but what was missing was any real ownership of the in-game decisions that could have prevented or countered those issues. When your offense gets stuck in isolation plays, you adjust by adding spacing. When your rotations are getting worn down by fatigue, you expand the bench to keep players fresh. When you're facing a young, confident team that's gaining momentum, you make the strategic moves necessary to regain control. Those are coaching decisions, and they were decisions that were within White's control to make. Instead, fans watched a coach explain after the fact how things went wrong while the proven solutions sat unused on the bench. That disconnect between identifying problems and taking responsibility for fixing them is exactly what has Fever supporters so frustrated with the current leadership. The broader context makes this even more significant. This isn't about one bad game or one questionable decision. This is about a recurring pattern where Indiana takes steps forward only to see careless mistakes and missed adjustments drag them back down. Earlier in the season, those collapses were frustrating but not devastating. Now, with the playoff race tightening and every game carrying additional weight, these preventable losses are becoming genuinely costly. Sitting in 7th place with the regular season winding down, the Fever can't afford to keep giving away winnable games against inferior opponents. Every dropped contest makes the margin for error smaller. Every missed opportunity puts additional pressure on the remaining schedule. When you're fighting for playoff positioning, losses like this one don't just hurt in the moment, they compound over time and make everything else more difficult. That's why Cunningham's message resonated so strongly with fans who watched this unfold. She wasn't asking for perfection or making unrealistic demands given the roster situation. She was demanding accountability, urgency, and the kind of competitive fire that turns close losses into hard-fought victories. She was calling for the mentality that makes opponents respect you even when you're not at full strength. The question now is whether this message will be heard and acted upon, or whether it becomes another example of players being held to different standards than coaches. Because right now, you have players like Boston and Cunningham taking ownership of their roles in what went wrong while hearing explanations from the coaching staff that stop short of that same level of accountability. That split between effort and leadership, between individual responsibility and strategic ownership, is at the heart of where this franchise finds itself right now. The players have shown they're ready to carry whatever load is necessary to compete. The question is whether the strategic decisions will support that effort or continue to leave it wasted. Sophie Cunningham didn't hold back because she recognized what was at stake. Not just this game, not just this season, but the culture and identity of a team that's trying to establish itself as a legitimate playoff contender. Her words were a challenge, a demand, and a warning all rolled into one. The Fever can get back to being dogs, but only if everyone from top to bottom commits to the same level of accountability she demonstrated in that post-game interview. The clock is ticking, the playoff race is tightening, and the margin for error continues to shrink. What happens next will determine whether Cunningham's message becomes the turning point this team needed.